The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. Check us out at cesnrg.com. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, the electrification of transportation and the EV transition. My guest today is Erika Myers of the World Resources Institute. She is the Global Senior Manager of EVs for WRI. Welcome to the show, Erika.
Thanks so much for having me, Tim.
I have been stalking you for a little while, and I knew you well as the EV thought leader at the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA, as we call it. And then you up and changed jobs on me, but that's awesome because now you have a global catbird seat, as we were talking about in the pre-show. So that's awesome for you. I'm very happy to see you, gaining traction, so to speak, globally. But we're going to talk all about electrification of transportation and solar and EV to grid, EV to home. But before we get into some of the nitty gritties of this topic, tell our listeners a little bit about your background. You have a history in the solar industry too. So share that with us and how you came to electrification of transportation.
Yeah, so I fell into this industry by accident, like a lot of folks do. So about 17 years ago, I was recruited to be an intern for a state energy office, and that internship ended up being 5 years working on electric vehicle, alternative fuel, clean energy policy, and activities for the state. And I just fell in love with the topic so much. It was one of these things that was constantly evolving, and I loved all the people who are in the industry, especially the early solar folks. They're just so enthusiastic, and I got the bug like they did about the opportunities for renewable energy. And from there, I moved to DC. I worked for ICF. It's a large consulting firm for about 4 years, supporting major, federal government agencies, utilities, and other private sector members on renewable energy planning and alternative fuels planning. And then I worked for SEPA for about 5.5 years, helping them to expand their portfolio beyond solar. They were previously a solar-focused organization, and we expanded it to a lot of other distributed energy resource topics. And then the last roughly 2-3 years, I was focused on transportation electrification. And again, it's a topic I've been following for a long time, roughly 12 years of my career. And I really wanted to focus in on it because I saw that it's like a really amazing turning point for the industry. And so the opportunity at the World Resources Institute came around, and I just couldn't say no. It was a great opportunity to not only help what we're doing domestically, but also with other countries that are also, aiming for zero emission vehicle targets. So it's been really fun. I've been there for about 3.5 months, so I'm still a newbie, but thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, definitely. Electrification of transportation is so important because 40% of our carbon footprint as a society, is transportation. And so we can make a major impact reducing our carbon footprint by cleaning the grid, first of all, because the electricity that we feed into these EVs has to be clean energy in order for the EV industry to be clean, but then converting cars, buses, and trucks to electrified vehicles. You and I are both early adopters of EVs. We shared with each other that we both drive Tesla Model Ys, and I've been chatting this up with John Weaver on the other show that I do, the Clean Power Hour, about my experience, which is mixed. It is a beautiful car and it is a lovely experience in many ways, but you do have range anxiety sometimes when you're in rural areas that don't have superchargers, or you end up using superchargers that are out of the way. And it's not without its inconveniences. I do love charging at home and with a level 2 charger in my garage, and that is awesome. I don't miss going to the gas station anymore. But you make up for it, right, with going to superchargers if you are traveling in your EV.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to kind of getting your perspective on where we are here in the US and where the puck is going, so to speak. I have very strong ties to Northern Europe. My children are bicultural and dual citizens in the US and Norway.
Hmm.
And Norway is one of the earliest adopters of EVs.
Yeah.
They've now breached the 50% mark of new sales of pure EVs. So more than 50% of new car sales in Norway are pure EVs. And they're planning to, I think they're banning uh, the ICE engine in 2025 or 2030. I don't know. Some of these European countries are really, stepping on the gas, so to speak. But where are we? Give us a big picture analysis of where we are in the US compared to other parts of the world.
Well, we're making progress, but we're still not there yet in terms of our EV sales and penetration compared to our peers in Europe or even China. And, I think a lot of where we've seen the most growth is in states that have EV friendly policies like California or other zero emission vehicle states, where they have requirements that auto manufacturers are selling a certain portion of their vehicles as electric. And so those sorts of policies help create additional incentives for people and educational opportunities for people to see what sort of alternative EV options are out there. There's actually a lot of studies that have shown that the same number and types of EV models in California are not in every state. And this is largely because of that policy. So we need to give people more choices. And that ultimately is my main takeaway. If we want to accelerate this EV transition, we need to give consumers more options and different vehicle models that will suit their particular needs. There's also restrictions in state policy on things like whether or not you can buy a vehicle online. And so those requirements also prevent some people from being able to buy things like the Tesla, which is ordered primarily online.
Yeah, there's some weird thing about Texas and Tesla, right? Tesla can't have dealerships in Texas, is that right? Because they sell direct?
No, I think the requirement is they have to have direct sale in order to sell there.
Because isn't that Tesla's model period? They're a direct to consumer
Through a
company.
dealership. Yeah, there's similar requirements in states like South Carolina,
Hmm.
which people they'll order their Tesla in South Carolina online, and then they'll go pick it up in North Carolina. So there's
Oh,
workarounds, but it's not like a great consumer experience.
yeah. And that's because they can't have a Tesla store where I got mine. I ordered it online, but then I went to a store, an hour away from my house, which is really just a place where they deliver vehicles. It's not like they didn't have a big fancy showroom or anything uh,
Hmm.
that I could see anyway. But so, that is one of our challenges, right? You put your finger on the fact that different states have different policies. California has been an early adopter, and they've created incentives for EVs and for manufacturers to make lower carbon emission vehicles, and that's basically working, right? I mean, there's way more EVs in California than anywhere else.
Yeah,
I mean,
last I checked, 650,000 EVs in California so far.
you can't go very far in LA or the Bay Area without seeing Teslas left and right, and and others. I mean, but let's face it, there's a very small collection of viable EVs today. It's about to explode. We're getting many more, and that's very different in Europe, right? There's probably 30 versions of an EV for consumers in the European market, whereas here we're stuck with maybe five right now, and that's going to double here in the next few years. But it's a totally different situation.
Yeah, in some states, you're right, it is a very limited pool of options. In California, it's significantly more, again, because of the zero emission vehicle requirement. So the manufacturers are selling more options in states like California. I know, in Virginia, Maryland has a zero emission vehicle requirement. And so they have nearly all of the different EV models for sale in Maryland. So a lot of people in the District of Columbia and Virginia will drive to Maryland just to buy a car, and then they'll have to go back and forth, to pick it up and get it maintained and things. So, I mean, that's a hassle for a lot of people. Is you really have to know what you want and have done the pre-work before you
Yeah.
even make a trip like that. And I think where a lot of people are is like unless they know about the EV, they're not even looking for it. So we have a lot of education that we need to do to make consumers even aware of the options. What are the benefits? What are the maintenance gains? Charging at home is a fantastic opportunity and experience for most people. We also have to think about the people who don't necessarily have at-home charging. How do we support them in providing, readily accessible public charging to supplement, what they may not have at home? So there's just a lot of variables that we could spend the whole hour talking about.
Yeah. So, but as far as decarbonizing transportation, what are the buckets of benefits that you see when you go, just looking at consumer vehicles, for example, when you go from internal combustion to electrified vehicles, what are the big buckets of benefits? Because there's several, and I think we should get those on the table, and then maybe we can further explore each of those.
So speaking from my own personal experience, which I oftentimes is a more compelling narrative on the benefits, I previously 2 years ago or 3 years ago owned two internal combustion engine vehicles. They were both SUVs. We realized we don't need two SUVs. This is excessive. So we traded in one of them for a Nissan Leaf. It was our very first experience owning and operating an EV. We bought it used because we wanted it to be cheap, and if we needed to get rid of it and get something else, then it gave us more opportunity to do so. It was very inexpensive. I think we paid less than $10,000. It was only a couple years old. It had very few miles. So we took it home. We didn't even get a charger. We just plugged it into the regular outlet on the side of the wall, and we started using it as our commuter car, and it was fantastic. It had great torque. We could get around the slowpokes on the interstate in DC. We love the fact it was compact, so we could park in a lot of spaces downtown. And we love the fact that we didn't have to take it in for oil changes. It was just extremely convenient, I think is the best word to describe it. And so I finally managed to convince my husband last year that we needed to get rid of the other SUV and get a full battery electric, which we ended up with the Tesla Y, because we do have, a kid and a dog, so we need a little bit more space. And I do not miss going to get oil changes at all, like never going to the gas station again. I get the fuel perks rewards through my grocery store. I'm like, I don't need them. So it's been, from a maintenance perspective, we're probably saving around $4,000 a year between maintenance and fuel between the two cars. And we're spending maybe $15 to $20 a month extra on our electricity bill. So the additional costs are negligible. We ended up getting a smart charger. So we are timing the charging to be during, quote unquote, the off-peak periods for our local utility. Even though there's no incentive to do that, we feel like it's, live and breathe transportation decarbonization. And so I want to make sure I'm not contributing to any peak issues. And then I also am paying for additional renewable energy through my local utility, which is a little bit of extra cost, but it's worth it.
Yeah, many consumers now have access to purchase quote unquote renewable energy, either wind or solar or a combination thereof. That's the case here. My city, the city of Urbana, Illinois, participates in a group purchase program with a bunch of other cities, and they've bought this huge bucket of mostly wind power. So that's all good. So my supply technically is renewable energy, and that's super important, right? If we're burning coal to make electricity to drive our EVs, we're not decarbonizing the economy.
That's exactly right.
We're just shifting carbon away from the tailpipe to the power plant.
Yeah.
And we are going to grow the power infrastructure, right? We're gonna perhaps grow the grid by 1.3 to 3 times. And it depends on who you talk to and what numbers you see. I don't know if you have an opinion about that in the US when you see into the future of
Mm-hmm.
a 90% EV world, how much more juice do we need on the grid?
Yeah. I
today.
hope it's not 3x more capacity than we have now. That's an unmanaged charging scenario where everyone, exacerbates the current peak load, which, as you know, we built the grid based on those 100 hours a year roughly of peak demand. And so we think that there is a definite way that we can add this, transportation electrification without significantly increasing the capacity requirements. The way that we do that is filling in those valleys, the other non-100 hours of the year when we have the lighter demand for electricity. And then for those 100 hours a year, maybe we think about other alternatives than capacity increases. Maybe we think about non-wire solutions. So that's when we would tap into things like battery storage or even the vehicles themselves, V2G, as a way to, spread out some of that charging demand. The other thing we have to think about too is not just, long duration charging, which is level 1 or level 2 charging, which is pretty, nominal impacts on the grid. We also need to be thinking carefully about the next generation of fast charging and ultra fast charging. There's all these terms being thrown around, what those really mean. But we're talking like megawatt level charging loads potentially for heavy duty vehicle applications. That's going to be a big stress on the grid, and certainly for capacity requirements. When we think about the types of capacity generators that could support that kind of load, it's going to be the natural gas peaker plants, and that's not necessarily going to get us to that decarbonization future that we were just describing.
Yeah, and this also, I think, brings up the value of DG, distributed generation, like rooftop solar. Combine that with a battery in your garage or a electric vehicle that is a battery on wheels,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're lightening the load on the grid. You're actually reducing the maintenance costs on the grid and reducing the cost of energy for consumers. There's several studies out now that when we reach high penetration of distributed generation like wind, solar, storage, then we are going to save consumers money. And of course, we're cleaning the air, so we're improving consumer health, which is another major flaw in the current grid that we have, which is, 50% coal or something like that. Um, that coal kills.
Yeah.
and and it kills millions of people globally per year. And maybe, I want to shine a light on that, and your work with WRI, because there is a focus on the health benefits. Right, when we electrify transportation, it does greatly reduce tailpipe emissions, which
Yeah.
are also deadly in and of themselves,
Yeah.
especially diesel emissions.
Yeah, we think that there's somewhere between 20 to 40,000 people who die every year from our transportation system in the United States. Half of those from diesel pollution. So a disproportionate amount of those deaths are coming from the delivery vehicles, the semi-tractor trailers, the really heavy duty vehicles like buses that are the ones that are causing a disproportionate amount of pollutants in our air.
Yeah, and we do crazy things. In my city, we have decentralized garbage collection, so there are now like 10 different garbage collectors, and literally now I have 10 garbage trucks going down my street instead of one.
Mm-hmm.
If the city just would have their own fleet of
Mm-hmm.
garbage trucks,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that just frustrates me to death, because it is so unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but since we're talking about the pollution that comes from internal combustion engine cars and trucks, talk a little bit about your work at the WRI, because that I know that this is a major focus.
Yeah, so we are working on a lot of different fronts, but most of our work right now is related to fleet electrification, and specifically as it relates to transit buses and now recently school buses. So we just received a big funding grant from the Bezos Earth Fund to help lay the groundwork for a complete transformation of our school bus system. We right now have 480,000 school buses in the United States that transport over 20 million kids every year. And we would like to make sure that these buses are electric, and we're trying to do that by 2030. There's a lot of studies that show that the diesel pollution that I just mentioned earlier, that is causing a lot of harm for society, that kids on buses have a 6 to 10x increase in personal exposure to those diesel fumes sitting in the school buses, which has a direct impact on the development of their lungs and their cognitive abilities. So we feel very strongly that this is a fleet that not only for the right reasons we should be electrifying, but also we think that it is a perfect application for fleet electrification. We know where the buses are parked every night. We know how much energy they're going to require. We know the routes that they're going to be using. So it's very predictable, and certainly from an energy demand management perspective, it's very easy to tackle this problem.
So when you look at the world, where do you see shining star examples of electrification of mass transportation, for example, including school buses?
Yeah, so we think that there's a lot of opportunities in the global south where transit buses are used predominantly for most of their transportation requirements. So Latin America specifically, we've done a lot of work in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. There's actually, probably most people don't know this who are watching this podcast, but the second largest fleet of transit electric buses in the world is in Chile. And the reason that they did that is because their air pollution is so bad in some portions of the country that they saw this as a health emergency for their citizens. And so they made this massive investment to procure all of these electric transit buses.
Yeah, I recently saw a little documentary about Shenzhen, China, and Shenzhen has electrified their mass transit. They have an electric fleet of taxi cabs, and they're just they're really light years ahead of us. Now it's hit and miss with countries like China, right? They're still building coal plants to generate grid electricity. They're also investing heavily in wind and solar. They are installing about 3 times the amount of solar on per annum as the United States is.
Mhm.
So I consider that to be a national security issue, frankly, because it will give them an advantage down the line. But um, so circling back though to how do we how do we effectively move forward when we have this agglomeration of 50 different states here in the U.S. and um, there is a lot of pressure from the top to let states do what they want to do, right? And so it's going to continue to be a patchwork. Here in Illinois, we had incentives for EVs and chargers some years ago. Those have disappeared. Um, of course, we now see the Biden administration shining a light on electrification of transportation. Joe Biden has made it clear that he wants to electrify the federal fleet of some 600,000 plus vehicles. But do you have kind of a recipe for success for electrification?
Wow. Well, that's a big question. It's a huge problem to tackle. And thinking through, if I were in the position to help the Biden administration figure it out, the number one thing that I would recommend is we need a national EV roadmap. We need to figure out how to bring together all these disparate parties so that we're all aligned on where we're making these critical investments to get this industry kickstarted. And I don't see so much of that coordination right now. I think we've been deferring too much to the private sector to determine where to put these chargers. That has all kinds of implications on who has access to this infrastructure. And there's a huge equity component to this that is not really adequately being addressed. So we need some sort of federal agency or organizing body to bring together all these different stakeholders, including the states, including all the different federal agencies to work together to grapple through this and really have a good plan, especially when it comes to infrastructure related to our interstates. So this is a huge opportunity, DOT, to potentially put charging at all those rest stops. We know rest stops are, well distributed across our interstate systems. Could we put charging infrastructure there as a first step to helping to enable this future? I think the other things we can talk about with the federal fleets, I just published a blog on this. So in addition to the roadmap, I think we need to do a lot more exercise in terms of how do the chargers get distributed? We need to have out of the box thinking on things like energy demand planning so that we're not creating a new problem with these peaker on-peak charging, for example. Some of the fleets are also distributed widely across the country, including remote locations. So how can we support that electrification also, in addition to maybe the easier, more urban areas where they may start to tackle fleet electrification first?
So does Pete Buttigieg have the chops uh, to become an expert in electrification of transportation? I don't know. I was curious to see him become the Secretary of Transportation. Uh, are we in good hands there, do you think?
I think Pete has what it takes to create that kind of momentum, absolutely, within DOT, and finding ways that we can help at a federal and state level to support transportation infrastructure deployment for EVs. And so I think that there is definitely a lot of promise in DOT. And I'm actually affiliated with the Women of Electric Vehicles, the DC chapter. And we have a woman from DOT that's going to be speaking to us this next week, Diane Turchetta.
Cool. Um, we never really got into the decarbonization piece. I want to shine a light on that again. So, there's the carbon that's coming out of the tailpipe. So that's an obvious one. When you switch from internal combustion to EV, that carbon is gone. There's the electricity that the EV is consuming. So we have to think about the grid and how that energy is getting from the sun to the car. And then there's the embodied carbon in the car itself, right? You have to make those batteries, you have to mine all the lithium and other rare earth elements, and put it together into a functional vehicle. You touched on some of the niceties of EVs. They have lower maintenance costs. You're not getting oil changes. You'll have less brake changes. You'll have more tire changes because of the torque that you also mentioned. But when that 40% footprint, so to speak, that transportation is to society, can we get rid of all of that, do you think? Or is it like, yeah, maybe 80% of that? Or what is a best case scenario, and by when? Like, we talk a lot about doing the clean energy transition by 2035 now. There's a lot of good evidence that this is totally doable if we invest our money where our mouth is. We have the technology. It's simply a matter of incentivizing the transition in key ways, and like the tax credit that the Biden administration is now considering for EVs, which is it's been missing from the Tesla community, right? Because their volume is such that they Tesla buyers couldn't take advantage of it. Now that's going to come back for them, which would be great, because Tesla is 70+% of the EV market in the US. But what is a best case scenario for a modern Western country like the United States? And yeah, and maybe we can talk about that in context of other nations.
Yeah, so when people ask me, can we electrify everything? I think that there is a future where that could be feasible. I guess the question we need to ask ourselves, is that the future we want? Because we have been almost 95+% dependent on oil for our transportation needs. And we've seen what happens when we're overly dependent on one single fuel. It leads to disasters, right? So we have got to think about this approach, I think, a little bit more holistically. And what other options do we have to decarbonize our transportation? At WRI, we think about it in 3 ways, and it's avoid. So any transportation trip you can not do, like for example, if you work from home for a certain number of days instead of going to the office every single day, that's the best outcome at the very, very base. Then there's shift. So how do we get people out of single passenger vehicles into other modes of transportation that are much more less carbon intense? So how can we get more people into transit? How can we shift to electric micromobility, e-bikes, scooters, things like that to help with some of those trips? And then the third is how do we improve? So that is related to this idea of shifting our transportation modes into these other forms, for example, with electric vehicles. And so when we think about those modes, and fuel types, there's not just electric, there's also green hydrogen is one that's emerging. There's renewable natural gas, which we know some of our transportation sector, for example, some of those garbage trucks you mentioned before, are using natural gas. So how can we get more of those to be using renewable natural gas? There's other kinds of biofuels like cellulosic biofuels. I've spent a lot of time researching that. I think there's a lot of promise related to that. Renewable diesel, renewable gas are other options. And then thinking about aviation, this is going to be one that's really tough to tackle. I think there's a lot of opportunity for different kinds of fuel types to support that decarbonization of the aviation industry. Similarly, marine, there's things like ammonia fuels, which I think, when I first heard about that, it sounded a little bit far-fetched, but it's actually gaining a lot of momentum and interest from the cargo industry, cargo ships. So I think the best case scenario is if we take a look at the landscape and as not just a country, but as a world, we make a solid commitment to zero emission vehicles and we make the necessary investments in the R&D to get us to the point where we have viable economic options for this future. I think that if we have set the bar really high, by a certain year, we want to get to X amount, and by this year, we want to get to X amount, that's where we really need to go. And I'm excited to see what COP26 will yield in terms of national commitments to decarbonizing transportation. I think there's a lot of momentum around this idea of ICE bans. So at the very least, restricting when people can buy internal combustion engines at a certain year. And then that helps to send a really strong policy signal to the investment community.
What is COP26 and what states in the US have put a stake in the ground on phasing out the sale of ICE engines?
So COP is the annual conference related to the Paris Climate Accord. So this is where all of the different policy community and decision makers get together every year to discuss how we're doing on Paris Agreement. This year it's in Scotland in November. But where we've seen ICE bans, we heard from Governor Newsom in California that he wants an ICE ban, but there's a lot of, I think, policy and regulation that needs to happen before that's actually law, because you can't just do it with an executive order.
New Jersey has put a stake in the ground. Massachusetts has put a stake in the ground on the phase out. Illinois is still just talking about this. We don't have any firm timeline. Illinois is also, well, our governor Pritzker is saying, hey, we're going to become a leader in infrastructure and manufacturing. We have Rivian here in our backyard in Central Illinois in Bloomington Normal. So we will have EV manufacturing going. And we have quite a few other automakers that have factories in Illinois. It is, one of the big automaker states among many here in the Midwest. But
yeah, one thing I'll add on to the ICE bans, I think they're great, but they're not going to work unless you do the work to educate your constituents first on what it actually means. So we saw this fallout in California. People like, I have to do what? What can I buy? They just didn't know. There just is a total dearth of consumer awareness about what the options are. And so we have got to make a lot more sizable investments to get people to be aware that there's actual legit alternative options available to them. And also that EVs are not just for rich people, which is the unfortunate perception at this point, because they see, equate EVs as Teslas, which are unfortunately extremely expensive. And so we've got to find, cost-effective alternative solutions at the same time that we're talking about ICE bans, because unfortunately, I think that we don't want to start off on the right foot when it comes to this transition, and that unless the constituents are behind you, that's the best way to alienate people against EVs.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. We need to make EVs more affordable. Elon Musk acknowledges this. He's going after a $25,000 EV. He's not there yet, but I think his cheapest EV now is more like 35,000 with the lower end Model 3s. And maybe Nissan is nipping at those heels as well. We are about to see an explosion though, with GM having put a stake in the ground, right, that they're going to
Yeah.
electrify the entire fleet, I think, or close to it by 2035.
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember, 2030 or 2035.
Yeah, that I was really excited to see that announcement, because I think most people equate affordable, reliable cars with the GM brand. And so if they're going that direction, then I think that sends a really strong signal to consumers that, hey, there might be a car for me.
Yeah, and they've had the Chevy Volt and the Bolt for a while now. Not my favorite cars. I've sat in both of those cars. They're just a little too small for me, um, but they're relatively popular, and we're going to see many more EVs coming. Um, so, as I said in the pre-show, Erica, I'm a little hobbled here. I don't know what I don't know, and you know, what should energy professionals and prosumers really be thinking about, and what are the ways that we should be engaging, so to speak, either in our local communities or nationally? I think about, for example, the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure problem. I see there, and I listen to a lot of podcasts on transportation. I see there being a shortage of chargers if somebody isn't really careful and stepping on the gas there. And there's obviously an opportunity. We have so many gas stations and so many rest stops on the highways, both the major highways and the secondary highways. Many of them have rest stops that are just sitting there waiting for better infrastructure to facilitate the transition.
Yeah. So I love this question, because if you are really interested and you are passionate and care about this transition, which I think, all of us should, because we only have so much time before the climate apocalypse. And I think that a lot of people are like, I don't even know what to do. Like, I don't necessarily want to buy an electric vehicle because it's too expensive for me. So how do I even start? If you can't afford to buy an electric vehicle, which a lot of people can't, I would still encourage you to work with your local governments to help enable this transition through things like more charger infrastructure, requiring new apartment buildings and new developments to at least make some charging infrastructure available, and to rough in or make it charger ready for the future when more demand is there. So making sure that the new developments are EV ready, so to speak. I think you should also look to different kind of grant programs. So here locally, I'm on my energy or environmental subcommittee, and we were able to get some funding from the Electrify America, $2 billion from the diesel emissions funding that they were required to pay through the EPA. So they're deploying all these chargers across the country, and we were able to get 8 of them for our city courthouse. And so those chargers are now free for anybody to use in the public. And that's, not only are they extremely visible, a lot of people in our community go to that courthouse, but also it shows them, oh, there's an EV charging here. EV, what is this thing? And like they start asking questions. And similarly, at the same location, I worked before COVID to bring in a couple of EV models to demonstrate and talk to people who were at our local farmers market. And taking a little bit of time to educate your community members about what this is and what are the benefits and what's your experience makes so much difference. And I think that's something everybody can be doing, even if they don't own an EV.
Yeah, I agree. Encouraging local governments to start to pay attention to infrastructure is a good thing. Here in Urbana, we have a fleet of fuel cell buses. We're getting a new fleet of hydrogen fuel cell. I don't know what the fuel is in the existing fleet. They're going to be generating hydrogen on site, potentially using solar energy. They're exploring solar options. They already have a rooftop solar array on one of the depots. So there are some baby steps being taken. And frankly, I bought a Tesla in part because of the supercharger network, it being as robust as it is, even though it's imperfect, especially in rural America. It's great if you're in a major city or on a major highway, but as soon as you get off of that, then you run out of superchargers very quickly, and then you're at the mercy of these other third parties. You mentioned Electrify America, there's ChargePoint, there's a handful of these companies that are going after that. I think that is truly a great economic opportunity for entrepreneurs and business leaders to step up and create something that is going to be in huge demand in a few years. It's a little hard to see because we're only at between 1% and 2% of penetration of EVs today, but that's only 7 doublings, I think, isn't it? If you're at 1%, you're within 7 doublings of 100%.
Hmm.
So do you think, I mean, how optimistic are you, I guess, about how smoothly we can make this transition to electrification of transportation?
Well, I have always considered myself a lifetime optimist, but in recent years, I think I've become a little bit more jaded about how the world actually works, and it doesn't always work out the way that you want it to. And I think if if our goal is perfect, we're definitely not going to get to perfect. And the part of the issue is that we don't really know what the best route is. We've never tried to replace 95% of our transportation fuel before in a matter of a decade. So we're learning things as we go. Like we know we're going to be making mistakes along the way. We know that we're going to have to pivot to maybe even new kinds of infrastructure or fuel types as we go along. And I think what we need to think about is from the consumer perspective, how can you make this as simple as possible? People do not like change. Change is hard. Change requires you to take a risk, and to, for a lot of people who are so dependent on their vehicles and their transportation modes for things like work, getting kids to the school, all these things that are very high priorities for them, any kind of change that seems risky is not worth doing. Even if there's other tangible benefits. So we have got to do whatever it takes to figure it out quickly on this path on making sure we have adequate infrastructure, we have the vehicle models are affordable, or this transition could end up dragging out for 50 years. And that's the version that I'm very scared about, because that's not going to get us to our greenhouse gas emission targets.
Well, Tony Seba does point out that we went from, 99% horse and buggy in 1903 to or 1901 to 90 plus percent internal combustion engines in about a decade, a little longer, 12 years. um, and so it is possible.
Mhm.
That wasn't easy either, right? I mean, you had to build gas stations, you had to build mechanics, to work on the cars, and of course there's the whole giving consumers access to that technology. Henry Ford is famous for making cars affordable. He wanted a car that was so affordable his workers could buy one, and God bless him, because that model still rings true today.
Mhm.
um, so I think it is just totally possible. I'm also, cautiously optimistic that, I see the impact that local authorities really have over things like renewable energy,
Mhm.
and how influential some of the embedded bureaucracy can be, like the utilities. They know how to slow things down when they want to slow things down. And but at the end of the day, I like to remind everybody that I think we are going to double the grid. I think we might triple the grid. And of course, that I want that to be clean energy.
Mhm.
And we have the technology, we have the sunlight, we have 10,000 times more solar energy than we could use in a year's time. So we're swimming in energy. It's just a matter of harnessing it for the greater good, and letting these old antiquated ways go by the by fall by the wayside. So, well, thank you so much, Erica. We will let you get on with your day. How can our listeners reach you?
So the best way to reach me is through WRI's website, and you can go search my name and it'll pop up my email.
Awesome. And I want to remind our listeners that they can find all of the solar podcast and clean power hour content at cesnrg.com/podcast. We bring you two of these interviews every week, plus a clean power hour where John Weaver and I break down the latest solar energy, renewable energy news, and we shine a light on all kinds of cool tech, like the recent Mars lander that has a solar powered helicopter on it, like zero emissions tankers that are being made in Norway, and of course, lots of news about electrification of transportation in general with Tesla, etc. So check us out, cesnrg.com/podcast. Please subscribe to the channel, give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and we love to hear from our listeners. So please make comments and tell us what you want to hear about. I'm one guy, and I'm super passionate for the energy transition, but I don't know what I don't know, as I like to point out. So I learn a lot from my guests and the listeners. So please share your thoughts. And with that, I will thank Erika Myers, the global manager of EVs for the World Resource Institute, for coming on the show. Thank you so much, Erika.
Thanks so much again, Tim.
Have a great day, everybody.